Okay, thank you. We should start the session. 4 of the presenters are here. I think they will introduce themselves. I shouldn't mention their name for the sake of time. So each presenter has 15 minutes to present, and the discussant will be given 4 minutes, and discussion on that paper will be 10 minutes. So in total will be around 30 minutes for one presentation. So let us start with the first presenter, Berg, combining preschool teacher training with parental education, a cluster randomized control trial. So you have 15 minutes. I will show you this when 5 minutes are remaining, and this one for 2 minutes.
Is it? Oh, 2. I always assumed that was 0 from the, I thought everybody was going over limit. That's good. Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to quickly go over this RCT that we ran in Malawi in informal childcare centers. So the majority of children in poor countries do not really have access to early education programs. And even in countries where there is some kind of either community-based or formal, informal preschools, the access rates are really varied. So richer people are actually, mainly in countries like Malawi, they actually opt out of the public sector and then they might go to some private sector stuff. But then generally poorer people are just much less likely to be in any sort of program in countries like Malawi. And then those who do attend, they're really attending very informal facilities that are often staffed by teachers that have low levels of education, practically no training, very little pay, if that, as you'll see in my presentation. So, you know, it was very eye-opening for me to actually go and visit like where these kids go to school, so to speak. And then the literature that I wasn't really aware of before I started this work, this lack of adequate preparation is a really big risk factor for poor performance in primary schools. And one of the things that was really surprising for me was that you'll go into a first grade or second grade in Malawi, and you already see in the data non-negligible rates of dropout. Like kids are already dropping out of school at the first, second year of school. And then you see the first grade and you realize why. In an average classroom, there'll be 60, 80 people, and then there's just one teacher. So if you've already fallen behind when you're age 3, 4, 5, you need one-on-one attention from somebody to just catch up. It's impossible. So you're not learning, you get discouraged, maybe you're hungry as well, and then you just kind of drop out. So it's not hard to see why this happens. And then people like, you know, famous McGregor study from Jamaica, they've shown that these kinds of losses can accumulate over time to the extent that as an adult, you'll just be much less likely to be earning any income and things like that, right? So Malawi really fits just squarely into this context. Very young population. One of the highest stunting rates in the world, about 1 in 2 kids is stunted in Malawi, and poor performance in regional testing by, if you look at SACMEC results and things like that. I now have a fair amount of kind of practice in running tests both for 3, 4-year-olds as well as adolescents in Malawi, and I can tell you that the performance rates are just dismal. You know, so if you actually do a test that the government says this is what you should be asking 8th graders, you'll just get close to zeros because you're really supposed to be asking them 4th grade questions, right? So growing access to ECD services through a variety of community-based childcare services centers is what's happening currently. So what happened in Malawi is that there are these places called CBCCs that I'm going to just abbreviate for community-based childcare centers. They're the primary method of ECD delivery, early childhood development service delivery in rural Malawi. They're community-owned and initiated, and they have these volunteer part-time teachers who tend to be mostly young women, married or unmarried. But as you can see, the part of it being volunteer is that you might quickly kind of transition out of that as soon as you get some other opportunity. So they tend to be quite untrained. There's a basic training of 5-6 days. They get some basic training, low levels of education, lack of play and learning materials. And then what I mean by sustainability challenges is that during our study, for example, so we first listed all the schools, And then within a year, when we went to do baseline surveys, a third of them were gone, right? So then we did our baseline survey. We have 200 schools. In round 2, 10 of those 200 schools were closed. In round 3, all of those 10 had reopened, and then another 21 had closed, right? So these are kind of not really stable. So in a way, like how I like to describe it is that there's no like early childhood schooling sector in Malawi. Like the government isn't spending, it's not a formal, there's no like money for preschool and things like that. So what the government says, well, these things exist. Why don't we invest in them instead of setting up a parallel system? Okay? So that's what we're looking at here. So will apologize. We went from my slides to PDF because of technical difficulties, which means that all the slides that I had hidden are now showing up on the PDF. So, and I'm going to have to remember where I want to skip to. I'm going to decide where I want it to skip to, ideally. So then what we've done is once the government said, look, we want to do some basic stuff here, right? So T1 and T2 are the basic things that they had wanted to do. So part of my work at the World Bank is I helped my operational colleagues as a researcher. So when we went, this part of it was kind of designed. UNICEF has a standard package of things that it gives to all preschools. So that was going to come, and that was going to be the control group. So every school will have like a blackboard and chalk and blocks and balls and swings and things like that. So that's the control group. And then they've actually done a pretty nice intensive 5-week residential training program, which works like this. So you go 2 weeks to a district capital where you get kind of like theoretical training and you get tested, etc. Blah, blah. You go back to school, you practice those skills for 3 months, the mentor comes once in a while, etc. Then you go back another 2 weeks, come back another 3 months, and then go back 1 more week and get certified, right? So that's the training bit. Fairly intensive and fairly up to date at the time that we were doing it. Still not as intensive as places like Chile and things like that, but quite reasonable for Malawi. The worry we had was that these teachers are volunteers, so if you actually give them training, they might just go get other jobs. So I suggested that we actually pay them to see both productivity effects and then retention effects. So that made T3, the third arm. And then the fourth arm, we actually said, so a lot of you with children, if you're living in Holland or something like that, you may be used to dropping them off at 8 o'clock and then picking them up at 5 o'clock, right? In Malawi, what happens is you drop them off at 8 o'clock and pick them up at 11. So a lot of these kids are spending the majority of their time with their parents, their waking hours. So we said, well, isn't it actually better maybe to do stuff with their parents rather than with their school teachers? And then the nice thing about this was that we said, let's do the parenting training via the newly trained teachers. So they'll do once a week group-based parenting training for a set of 12 weeks. Right? And they teach them how to talk to their children and chatter and sing and play and talk about letters and numbers and things like that. I'll show you some examples in a second. So as you can see, it's a cluster randomized trial. So the 4 groups are like 4 groups of schools. Right? It's not individually randomized at all. And then at each school, we picked 12 children who were currently attending that school. And then half of them are 3-year-olds, half of them are 4-year-olds, half of them are girls, half of them are boys. And then we block stratified the randomization. Okay, so I'll just go here. What data sources do we have? First of all, we have all these child assessments. So these are, for example, showing on the left-hand side, you're seeing kind of like language skills. This could be either a receptive one or another one where you're saying like, what is this? And then he's supposed to say car, or you're saying, here's a car, what color it is. And things like that. They do PPVTs where there's four pictures, and then they're supposed to say what which picture matches with the word that's given to them. On the right-hand side, he's trying to decide which one is heavier, right? So first of all, he has to understand what heavy means, and then he also has to have the kind of skill to say. So there's assessments like this for the children. And then we have at the primary caregiver, by that what I mean is actually a parent, but sometimes parents aren't present, so it could be a grandmother or an auntie or something like that. So we have measures, self-reported measures of what kinds of things they do with the kids. And then finally, at the CBCC level, we have classroom observations. What that means is I send you two to be a fly on the wall in the classroom for 2 hours. And you observe, you take notes, and afterwards you have to have consensus on like a set of 37 questions that we said, what happened in this area? You know, and I'll show you some examples in a second. So it's independent, but it's not as good, let's say, as like videotaping the classroom and then having transcripts literally kind of transcribed afterwards, such as like the class measure and things like that. So these are some of the things that you can, so I'm going to start by showing some 18-month effects. So 18 months later, which is about 12 months after the training intervention ended, we went back to do our first round of impact evaluation. This is what's happening in the school. So for example, one of the things you want to see is that this big classroom, you know, the CBCC could be as big as this, just without the steps. You know, on this corner, there's like a singing going on. Here, they're drawing. Over there, they're doing something else. You know, as you can see in the control group, there's no such thing whatsoever, where you can see in the treatment groups. So these classrooms are looking visibly different within a short period of time. I don't have children, so I had to learn all these things, but apparently you're not supposed to tower over children when you're talking to them, but you're supposed to just be like this. So, you know, you can see that the standing while interacting with children is going down, whereas, you know, largely sitting is going up. You're supposed to separate 2, 3-year-olds from 4-year-olds because they have different needs. So separating children. So all the desirable things are going up in these classrooms. There's fine motor activities. Kids are actually drawing and things like that. And actually, I'd like to show the control group time trend because you remember that they're getting basic materials, right? So even the fact of getting materials was already making them much more likely to be reading or discussing colors and like things like that. And these are nice because actually there's a way where you say, well, okay, what is this color? That's a kind of a very specific rote way of talking about colors. Or you're supposed to actually work that stuff into other things. Like you see a car passing, you say, oh, look, that's a car, that's a round car, that's a big car, that's a blue car, right? So that's also how the training emphasizes with parents when they're talking with their children to just kind of do these types of things. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go here to some formal impacts on the final outcomes that we're interested in, and then show the pathways quickly. I have 3 minutes left, is it? Yeah. Oh, you're saying 5, that's good. So language and hearing skills only in T4. So T4, you remember, it's the combined intervention, which I'm just going to call it combined. It's the parenting plus the teacher training. You can see that with the teacher training, with or without incentives, we're not finding anything, right? But the teacher training with parenting, actually a pretty decent size effect on language skills, nothing on fine motor, and their convex combination together kind of barely significant at 0.13 standard deviation improvement. Okay? And then there's this strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which you do with the mother. We have weak evidence of like the difficulties decreasing, so a negative effect there is good. And then the prosocial index actually has quite a big and very significant effect. So these are things like, is your child a caring child? Is she willing to share with people? Does she show empathy? Does she have a best friend? And things like that. We're seeing quite a big improvement, again, only in the combined intervention, nothing in the other arms. Okay? You can see why, because only in the T4, for example, that all the parenting quality index is lighting up. So this is all coming from the fact that these parents are self-reporting to us, saying that I'm much more likely to, you know, when I'm cooking, talk with him and say things, and then, or we draw on the ground like triangles and things like that. This is what they report they're doing, and then it's not so much that they're being less disciplinary or they're less stressed or they have better mental health, it's just that the self-reported activities are what's lighting up. As I showed you before, the classroom observation index is lighting up all over the place in all arms, because all these classrooms after teacher training, they do look visibly different. It just does not translate into any child outcomes. 2 minutes, great. So this makes my next slide much better that I did it. So I'm going to skip the heterogeneity, but it's actually really interesting. So ask me in the Q&A about the heterogeneity of impacts. So here, yes. Okay, 36 months results. For those of you who are not Americans, you may not know what a big donut is. It's just supposed to stand for a big zero, right? So that's what we have at 36 months, nothing, right? If I had time, let's run through quickly. And at follow-up, we have way more assessments because these kids are older now. So I can do PPVTs, I can do math, I can do reading. We can do Kaufman assessment of battery for children. Things like I go like this, and then you're supposed to repeat it. I tell you 5, 6, 4, 2, 8, or give you the number pi or something like that. You're supposed to repeat it back to me, things like that. We have all of these tests, anything you can imagine. All of them have no stars nowhere, right? So don't ask me about multiple hypothesis testing because I don't need to do it, right? Right? So then I think the last word should kind of be 18-month effects. My time says I'm up. 18-month effects, pretty decent. 36 months completely gone. It's not an issue of power. Like those zeros are kind of pretty tight zeros, right? Recent paper from Chile where the teacher training intervention is much more intense, like 2 years of professional training. Exact same thing. The biggest RCT that exists. Classroom looks completely different. Child tests not improved at all, right? Now, on the other hand, there's a recent paper by Caridad Araujo, Norbert Schadi, and a couple of other people in the QGA last year that shows that teacher quality does matter. But that's endogenous teacher quality. Mine is like exogenously induced classroom change, right? Whereas in their case, there's a distribution of teachers and then you randomly assign the kids. So maybe there's a difference there, and that's why. So the only other hypothesis we discussed with Jerry Berman about this, and he was saying maybe what you're supposed to do is that these kids are supposed to go into something that's also good. So if you give them this short intervention where they're exposed for like a year or two, and then they get to primary school and the quality of primary schools is really bad, there is no what Heckman calls a scaffolding. You need to be able to build up. There need to be scaffolds everywhere. So he said maybe your next experiment should be do the same thing, the one that worked, the combined intervention, but then randomize kids when they come out of it into good schools and give vouchers for like better schools or something like that randomly, and see maybe if your effects persist that way rather than they just completely go away. So let me stop there because I'm probably 1 minute over time or so.
Okay, thank you, Berk. The paper, I enjoyed reading the paper. It's very interesting, and I think the experiment he did, most of them are scalable. That makes them important in terms of policy applications. Berk assessed the government intervention in the community-based child care center. So he has two basic treatments, providing training to the teacher, including the incentive, and also provide parenting. Then, at the end, his conclusion, as he explained it excellently, is that teacher training does not have impact, but only when it is supported with parental involvement, then it has an impact on child outcome. So my observation, my questions raised from these factors. So if intervention in terms of improving teachers' characteristics or quality in terms of input is improved, and if it doesn't have impact on child outcome, then why do we intervene? So can this result be scalable and advised this way? Yeah? So maybe much more explanation might be important. And the study uses this treatment, but they are not exploiting the full factorial design. For example, would the involvement of the parents would bring an impact without training the teachers? Now is combined with the teacher training. That element would have brought a lot of importance, a lot of valuable results if that treatment was applied without teacher training. That is excluded. Why they exclude, I don't know. He might have a reason. Third is that the effect of combined parental intervention at the 36 months follow-up didn't bring any impact. That means there is a fade-out effect, that the effect of those interventions in the long run are not helping. So if in the long run is not helping, usually in the preschool literature, the impact of preschool fades out if the children are not in the disadvantaged position. But for a disadvantaged children, the impact persists because they are not getting good primary education. And when we see Malawi, maybe most of the children are disadvantaged. And I was expecting a long-term effect. So taking this result at its face value, so it doesn't have a long-term impact. Should we invest in teacher training at preschool? And should we invest in parental coaching at preschool if it doesn't have long-term impact? Thank you very much. So you want to answer or collect more questions?
Why don't I quickly answer those few, which I think they want me there because of the taping. Is that correct? Yeah, okay, thanks. Thank you very much for those. So let me start with the why intervene if it has no impact. That's exactly what I said to my colleagues at the World Bank. But there's a couple of things that make things a little more complicated here. So there's this entire literature, mainly in the United States, that shows exactly this pattern. So you get very short-term impacts. In the medium term, they'll disappear, and then they pop up as adults. So there is the Preschool project, there's the Episodarian, there's a whole bunch of these that kind of have the same pattern. So actually it's very unsatisfying. It's actually on my slide there. People are telling me, oh, you got to go back when they're like 25 years old, you know. So we said, well, actually we'll start like a little sooner than that. I will be retired by then. But you know, so there is that. So we can't exactly be sure kind of where these impacts went. My sense, though, is that, and especially working with my co-authors, some of which are ECD experts from Berkeley and places like that, they're saying, well, look, this was already a low-intensity intervention to begin with, and combined with the fact that you mentioned that disadvantaged kids are going to these poorer schools, it's catch-up is kind of inevitable. Like, in a way, my favorite kind of amateur story on this is that everybody will learn the color green and then the number 6. It's just that our kids learned them a bit sooner, right? And then though they kind of like, they didn't diverge further or keep up even the opening, it's just that they actually kind of slow down and then the other kids eventually catch up. So I do think that in a way, this program is really ineffective in the long run in the setting of Malawi. So I agree with you that you wouldn't want to scale this up. But then on the other hand, I do sympathize with those ideas that there was something there that showed some promise. Maybe let's take that and then say, okay, what was the bottleneck for sustainability? Let's try to deal with that. And then the issue of the factorial design, this is just killing us. So McCartan yesterday said like he is 6 rejections and counting. This paper is 3 rejections and counting. And each time we get the exact same comment about we don't have a classic 2x2 factorial design. The whole reason is because I work at the World Bank and I actually designed this not for academic publication, but because this design made sense. Because the only way you will have scalable parenting intervention in Malawi is not by sending outside consultants in there to do parenting intervention, but by actually having people in the community who are already trained to do it. So there is no parenting intervention in the sense we think of it without the trained teachers, right? So don't ask me the question, what would have happened if you just did parenting? Because I don't have that intervention because it doesn't make sense to me, right? So that's the answer to the factorial design. And then this heterogeneity is actually the thing you said, Taseo, about the disadvantaged kids. It's actually worse. The results that I wasn't able to show, all those T4 effects, 20% of our kids have mothers with primary school certificates. The rest of the 80% have pretty much, like we can call them, low or uneducated mothers. All the effects are coming from the 20%. The effect on kids with a primary school educated mother is 0.5 standard deviations. You don't see 0.5 standard deviation effects in many of these interventions. What does that mean? I showed you 0.2 roughly effects on average. Yeah, you can do the weighted average. That means that the effect on the other 80% is close to zero, right? So this intervention is not a substitute for disadvantage. Substitute for advantage. It's actually a complement, right? So we have to also think about that. So for example, Jim Barry has a nice paper where they did adult literacy along with this kind of thing, and they're showing effects. Because they have like 40,000 children, they have like 5 stars everywhere, but the effects are very small. So I'm not, but maybe that's kind of the way to go, is that, well, if you don't have educated mothers, then you might have to do both like education for the parents as well as kind of parenting training, etc. So let me stop there and take a couple questions if we have time.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I just have a question, if you have some sense of the mechanism behind the different results when you add the parenting intervention on top of the teacher intervention. What makes it more effective?
Yeah, so there's 2 things. One is that you probably didn't see, I went through too quickly those graphs, but you see even the classrooms are a little better with the parenting intervention, which wouldn't make sense if the parenting intervention was like you guys were thinking, it's like cross, but it's actually, maybe the teacher is actually reinforcing herself as she's teaching the parents on what they're supposed to do. So there's part of it, I think, is coming from the fact that potentially the classrooms initially were a little bit better, right? But then the other part of it, it seems completely to us, because we have a lot on the mother or the primary caregiver, and it's all things like I read her books and then I talk with her more, like we do numbers, we do English words, etc. And it's nothing about how they discipline the child. It's not even about the quantity of books at home, etc. changing. It's constant pretty much. And it's not reduced parenting stress, like we have a parenting stress index that relates specifically to the child in question. And that doesn't change at all. The mental health of the mother overall doesn't change. So we really think it's kind of parenting practices in the sense of, those things that are happening in Vermont and things like that, you put like gadgets on people that record everything you say. And people essentially show that the wealth gradient in the number of unique words spoken are like orders of magnitude different between rich and poor people. It's the same thing, like when you don't have that, you're inducing just with the Save the Children intervention, just a little bit of kind of like variation in like the words they use. And maybe when they're cooking, they just completely ignored the kid before. And now they actually say, okay, let's chatter, let's sing a song and whatever, etc. And then in 18 months, you see something, but then nobody keeps up. Like neither did these teachers keep, I didn't show you those effects, but all of those transmission mechanisms pretty much halved by the second round, both at the classroom level and at the parent level, right? So a 0.3 effect becomes a 0.12 effect and it's insignificant and things like that.
Okay, in the middle.
Yeah.
Thanks. So especially the last 2 comments, your response here, and then the discussion of the heterogeneity issue makes me wonder if part of the issue is that you're trying, that the way the training is done and the methods is almost trying to reverse engineer something that's already there, it's this unobservable kind of skill. And if you say, okay, here's a marker of this stuff, you squat and you do that, but you're actually not getting that kind of skill thing. You're just getting the markers of it. It's really not, you're missing the big part of what's effective. So in what sense do you think, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, maybe for the sake of time, we
sure, we take another one. Yeah.
Last question. River on your back.
I don't?
Okay. Could it be a small sample problem? It's great that you have 4 interventions. We're testing 3 interventions and you have 4 samples, but you are losing power when you split your groups. Oops. Okay, it's on. Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, could it be a small sample and power issue that you're not getting significant coefficients? Because you're splitting the sample by 4 and you're getting pretty small groups in each, it seemed.
Okay, yeah, let me start with that. I don't think so, because the effect sizes that we detect are pretty much exactly the ones that we hypothesized that we would be able to detect ex ante, and then it actually turned out exactly it is. So yes, if you're asking if I ran like every pairwise comparison between round 2 and round 3, and would I be able to reject that in round 3 the effects really disappeared in this statistical sense of disappearing, maybe some of them I won't be able to reject, but in round 3 I'm able to detect exactly the same size impacts as I did in round 2, but I don't, right? So it's, if you think a 0.2 effect is not worth detecting, then maybe, but I don't think it's a, we did power calculations pretty carefully. I mean, this is a ginormous cluster randomized trial for the standards of like cluster randomized trials. We have 200 schools. I could divide it into 6 and it'd still be okay. So I don't think that's it. Now, your question is a really good one. Unfortunately, I'm not an ECD expert, but I do think that there's something about internalizing the message that you get over time. And one aspect of the implementation of this project that failed, I think, was the mentoring and supervision aspect of it. So at school, they were supposed to get a lot of reinforcement. So imagine this person, not only they get like 5 weeks of training and maybe they haven't internalized everything exactly, but they're unpaid person, and then they don't really get the support that they're supposed to get, and we don't really go back at 18 months and tell them, look, all these things that you were doing, it really worked. Right? So keep doing it. And without all of that, it's easy to see, without seeing the fruits of your labor and seeing that, not knowing exactly why that was important, like you said, squatting, right? You may have a point there, but I'm not enough of a child development scientist to be able to kind of theorize on it.
Okay, thank you, Berk. We will move now to the second presenter, Yared. Impact of learning in mother's tongue. First, evidence from natural experiment in Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming out this afternoon for this session. My name is Yared Saeed, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of mother tongue instruction in primary education in the context of developing country. So this is a follow-up paper from the prior work that I have published on Economics of Education Review. So in that paper, what I tried to document was to see whether mother tongue instruction improves educational outcome. So what I did was I exploited a reform in Ethiopia, which was signed into law in 1994. So one of the main components of that reform is introduction of mother tongue education in primary school in Ethiopia. And I exploited that variation and tried to see whether kids who have been instructed in their mother tongue performed better than their peers who have been instructed in a language different from their mother tongue. So that's my prior paper, and in this paper, which is still a work in progress, and your comments are much appreciated, is what I'm trying to see is to see whether the gain in academic achievement by kids who are taught in their mother tongue will be carried over to later years once these kids start learning in English. So that's what I'm going to show you today. So I guess why this is important, partly because there is a move among many developing countries to mother tongue instruction, partly because the UN states that it is a sort of a human right for kids to be instructed in their mother tongue in elementary school. And also if kids who are taught in their mother tongue are better off in terms of gaining academic achievement in primary school and maybe later in the labor market outcomes, what this means is that the choice of mother tongue instruction might set kids from different language groups into different trajectory. So that's why I think this is important. So I guess the key finding for me, okay, I guess again to give you a little bit background so that this slide might make sense is, as I said, in Ethiopia, as in many developing countries, after completing few years of schooling, students transition or switch to English instruction. I think this is believed to be important because, at least in Ethiopia, high school education and college education is in English. So it, as part of the preparation of students to higher education, after completing few years of schooling, the students are somehow, in a way, instructed in English. So I exploited this variation and, of course, the education reform and estimated triple diff models, and what I found out is a positive effect on performance in mathematics and literacy test score. And I'm going to discuss this in a little bit detail. So now let me give you a little bit background. So Ethiopia is a very big country with approximately about 90 million population, and also it's a multi-ethnic, multilingual country where more than 80 languages are being spoken. So this makes it a bit difficult in the sense that, for instance, the 1994 education reform was introduced, and then Ethiopia has moved to mother tongue instruction. So what this reform did was provided discretion to state governments to choose the medium of instruction in their jurisdiction. So as a result of this law, now the medium of instruction is more than 25. But if you consider, I mean, that's a big move because in 1990, before the introduction of this reform, Amharic, which is the official language of Ethiopia, used to be the only medium of instruction in primary school. But now it's more than 25, which is good. But if you compare this with the number of languages that are being spoken within the geographic boundary of Ethiopia, we have still way to go because, I mean, it's estimated to be, I guess, more than 80 languages are being spoken in Ethiopia. So what this means is that still today, after all this effort, a number of kids are being instructed in a language different from their mother tongue. So I guess that's a challenge. So the 1994 education reform has provided, the discretion to state governments not only to choose the medium of instruction within their jurisdiction, but also to choose as many languages as they see fit for their circumstances. Ethiopia has about 9 states and 2 federal cities. So following that introduction of mother tongue instruction law, many states has chosen their state language as a medium of instruction in primary school, and also additional minority language as a medium of instruction. So the other thing that might be interesting to know is, because Ethiopia is so diverse, no matter how hard you try, you still find a reasonable number of kids who are still learning in a language different from their mother tongue. So again, in Ethiopia and many states, language majority states are being instructed in their mother tongue, and language minority students are being instructed in a language different from their mother tongue. So this is one variation that I am exploiting in the diff and diff. And the other thing, or the other discretion that Ethiopian states have, is to choose the timing of transition or switch to English instruction. This is still under the state's discretion. So as a result, as you see here, some states transition to English instruction in grade 5, others in grade 7, and others in grade 9. So you see where I'm heading. I mean, this is also a very interesting variation that I used to estimate the diff and diff equation. So the data source that I'm using in this paper come from Young Lives. Young Lives is an international research project based here in University of Oxford. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this data. It's a very interesting data. It has a longitudinal household survey data of 2 cohorts, but in this specific paper, I am interested in the Ethiopian school survey, which was conducted in 2012. So this is also very interesting. You can link this data with the household survey data, but I guess the overlap is a little bit not as much as you hope it to be. So because of that, I, for the most part, stick to only data that come from the school survey. So you observe basic household, student, and school level characteristics. And the most interesting aspect of this paper, I mean, this data, at least for me, is it administers math and literacy tests to grade 4 and grade 5 students, both at the beginning and end of the academic year. So what this means is that it enables you to estimate a value-added specification. So that's exactly what I did in this paper. So yeah, I guess this is, I mean, these are the left-hand side. Variables are, you know, test scores, standardized test scores on both math and literacy test scores. And yeah, this is the descriptive statistics. I guess for the interest of maybe time, I've thrown in a bunch of control variables like student level, household level, and also school and class level variables, but these are the main left-hand side variable. Actually, wave 2 is the test administered towards the end of the academic year, but I control for math D score and literacy D score, which was administered at the beginning of the school year in order to ensure that I'm estimating value-added specification. So going back to the triple diff model, I guess I have to take you back and explain a little bit about one specific state which is interesting in Ethiopia and also in this data. So Southern Nations and Nationalities People, it's called SNNP in short, is the most diverse state in Ethiopia. More than 50 languages are being spoken and more than 10 languages are being adopted as media of instruction. So, and also this is, at least compared to the states that we have or we observe in this specific data, the only state that its students transition to English instruction in grade 5. So all the other states in this data transition to English instruction either in grade 7 or grade 9. So what this means is that when students in SNNP state progress from grade 4 to grade 5, there is a switch in the language of instruction from mother tongue to English instruction. That's for language majority students, and from I think non-English second language to English instruction for language minority students. So because SNNP is unique in that sense, because it shifts its medium of instruction a bit earlier, I consider it as experimental state, and all the other states in Ethiopia which are observed in this data are considered as non-experimental states. So this is a binary dummy which takes a value of 1 if a child is observed in SNNP state and 0 if it is observed in other states. So when it comes to this treated variable, this is also a binary dummy which takes a value of 1 if a student is a language majority student and 0 if a student is language minority student. So what this means is that if a student is being taught in a mother tongue between grade 1 and grade 5, this takes a value of 1. But if a student if a student is being taught in a language different from mother tongue between grade 1 and 4, this value takes 0. When it comes to after, I have to remind you again that I observe only grade 4 and grade 5 students, and the test is being administered only for grade 4 and grade 5 students. But in SNNP state, the medium of instruction is mother tongue up to grade 4, and then they switch to English instruction in grade 5. So in order to exploit that, after takes, it's a binary dummy which takes a value of 1 for grade 5 students, and it is 0 for grade 4 students. So in a way, you can consider grade 5 students are being exposed to the shock, if you want, because they are being switched to mother tongue, English. No, initially they have been, sorry, let me say that again. Grade 5 students are exposed to the shock in the sense that now they are being instructed in English, but grade 4 students are still being instructed in the same language. So if once these are being defined, this is the standard diff and diff model. So the variables that I am interested in is this one. This is the third level interaction. So this tells you whether kids who are being instructed in their mother tongue between grade 1 and grade 4 perform better in those tests which are administered in grade 5 relative to kids who have been instructed in their second language between grade 1 and grade 4. So this is a quick result that I want you to point to. So again, I guess, yeah, I've estimated this in the paper, like you'd be able to see OLS and also other different versions, but the one which is really interesting, at least for the sake of this presentation, is this one. So we have a bunch of control variables and this lagged test score, which presumably be a sufficient statistics to control for some unobservable historical educational inputs or household characteristics, and also unobservable individual characteristics such as, for instance, differences in ability. So when you look at this one, this is the third level interaction, which is positive and statistically significant. This is for math score, and for literacy score as well, it's positive and significant. So this tells you that kids who are being instructed in their mother tongue first perform better after they transition to English instruction. So this is a very, I guess, a very interesting conclusion, in the sense that language that are, subject contents that are being acquired through mother tongue can be translated to different language. I guess that's one way of seeing these results. So I've run also falsification tests. In order to do that, mind you, I have experimental state, which is SNNP because the medium of instruction changed in grade 5. So I dropped that experimental state in the falsification test, and then I have all these non-experimental states, which I randomly grouped into two. In order to ensure that this is random, the Ethiopian government assigns administrative number to administrative states and also subnational governments. So in a way, I kind of assigned odd-numbered states into placebo experimental state and even-numbered state into experimental state, and did the same exercise, that the triple-leaf estimation, and what I found out, the coefficient estimate of this variable is insignificant. So that tells you that, again, my results are not being confounded. And I also did heterogeneity by location of residence. It seems significant in, the effect seems to be stronger in rural areas, but I didn't find any heterogeneity by gender. So if you are more interested into the results, I'm sure you can take a look at the paper on the web. So I guess this is the conclusion. Again, for the interest of time, I might not be repeating myself, but I want you to bring your attention to the last one. As you see in the previous presentation, even if there is a short-term effect of the intervention, this positive effect sort of fades away through time. So this might be happening again. In an ideal world, what I would like to see is whether kids who are being taught in their mother tongue would perform better in the labor market later. But I can't think of any publicly available data that I can use to check that. Maybe that's a topic of another paper. But at least what I found out now is kids who are being taught in their mother tongue in the first 4 years perform better in grade 5 after they transition to English instruction classrooms. But again, this coefficient should be interpreted carefully, because this is a very short-term effect of learning in mother tongue. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Okay, discussant.
Thanks. At the risk of aging myself, like before that 1994 reform, I was actually backpacking through Ethiopia for like 6 weeks, and absolutely the most memorable parts were like SNNP and Oromia. And one of the things that I mentioned it is relevant because I thought at the time to myself, there's no sign of government here, right? In the sense that like I had passed through northern Ethiopia, I had passed through Addis and the lakes region and etc. And then I had seen schools and clinics and hospitals, etc. When I got down there, like I wasn't seeing any of these. So it's actually really nice now. It makes me actually want to go back and see, because I am now imagining government schools, not only government schools, but they're actually teaching in local languages and things like that. Just wonderful to think about. The question to me is new. Like I actually hadn't thought about this question before, but I've been actually seeing recent evidence that actually it's gathering in line with what you're suggesting, Yared. So it's a nice question, and it's really innovative in the sense that, you know, he's taking advantage of things that are in the Young Lives data that he has access to, that he can take advantage of. And then he finds a kind of like a medium-sized conditional correlation of kind of being taught to in your mother tongue in school first, on later scores of about 0.3 standard deviations for math and a much smaller one for literacy. Okay, so I have a couple of comments here. So one of them is that wonder whether it's almost too innovative a paper. So in the sense that, so this is a quote by Donald Rubin, who's kind of like the father of, for at least economists and statisticians, kind of the causal inference literature. So he says no causation without manipulation. So a treatment must involve a manipulation, right? So think of the statement, smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking is the treatment. And I can actually imagine you, for example, you decide to smoke. That's one state of the world. If I can also see you in the future when you decided not to smoke, the difference between those two worlds is the treatment effect, right? That's what we mean by treatment and a manipulation, right? So think of the statement, she didn't get a job because she's a woman. Now, being a woman is not a treatment, not unless you're thinking of like gender reassignment surgery or something like that, but then you have to be very specific. You have to be very specific about the manipulation, and that's the treatment, and that's the effect. But when people say she didn't get the job because she's a woman, they're not talking about that. They're saying, like, if it was a man, he would have gotten the job, right? They're not saying, like, if she turned into a man, she would have gotten the job, right? So here, there are two claims in this paper to what's the treatment. So one of them is switching to English medium. Like, it could be that, you know, during the course of your schooling, you switch at a certain grade, or you never switch. Like when I was growing up in Turkey, you switched after primary school. In some schools you never switched, right? You just kept going in Turkish the whole time, right? We can imagine manipulating this. This is not hard. In fact, the government passed a policy, but it's not the question that's being asked here. That's not his interest. His interest is really what's the effect of mother tongue on stuff. So let's set that aside. So it's being almost more as a circumstance. There are some states where they switch earlier, some states that they switch later. So if I look at them at the time when one switched but the other didn't, it gives me some advantage. But it's not really a treatment, so to speak. Not one Yared is interested in. Now, learning in your mother tongue first is, right? But it's being proxied by being a language minority in the place of residence. Now, think about that. That's just like being a woman, right? That I can't manipulate that unless, so we can think of worlds where people only live where they're born. Then it's completely a circumstance, and it's not a treatment. We can imagine planting you somewhere different, like there were forced relocations in the history of Ethiopia, but then I'm changing a lot of other things along with your mother tongue. Education versus your language minority status may change, but all these other things are changing. So what we can think about is that I really assign some people in SNNP to schools randomly where they would be teaching in their local language as opposed to teaching in the majority language. That's the treatment, but we don't have that here, right? So my suggestions for this paper, to the extent that you're submitting, you're not yet forthcoming or anything like that, is that I would actually dispense with the language of natural experiment and plausibly exogenous and things like that, because I don't actually think you have strong claims to those statements. I don't see any natural experiment here. There's no like rainfall shock or something like that. And I don't see those things, so for example, being a language minority in the place where you live, as being plausibly exogenous. That would be stretching the meaning of plausible, I think. And then I would spend more time convincing us that the counterfactual outcomes would have been different, right? So the triple difference has assumptions that are hard to satisfy, even in cases where you're doing something like a RCT. I mean, I have a project where I have an early treatment and a delayed treatment, and then there's a third group of ineligible people. And then we said, okay, after the late treatment people are treated, we lose the experiment, but we can still do the triple diff, because there's these other people who are still remaining untreated. And then when we look at the time trends for them, they were completely different. So even in an RCT setting where we planned to do triple diff, we couldn't do triple diff because the assumptions weren't satisfied. I think it's going to be much harder here. So you need to do much more empirical work rather than cite other papers to say this is plausible. The table you showed everybody, those groups are different than each other. That's for sure. Like if we think of grade 4 people as baseline data, they look different. So the trends have to be parallel, but we don't really have trends because of the cross-sectional nature of the data. And the final thing is the falsification tests. I really thought that that was going to be the one that convinces me. But unfortunately, falsification tests have very low power. So for example, your Spanish result, the point estimate is identical to your treatment effect. It's just that its standard error is literally quintupled. And that's because your R-squares in your regression went down so much, A, because you halved your sample, but then B, also you randomly assign treatment, so there's no explanatory power anywhere. So it's just your falsification tests have very low power for me to say, oh, those are real zeros. Even in the math one, the confidence interval includes the 0.269. So I think that you have to tone that down a bit, or maybe find some other way of doing it where you inject some power into it. Right? And then finally, it really frustrated me, even though it's a completely mistake like I would make. I was like, are these literacy tests in Amharic or in the modern tongue, or are they in English? And it's nowhere in the paper. And so, it would be a different interpretation, I would have thought, if their English reading comprehension is much better, as opposed to their Amharic reading comprehension is much better, or something else, right? So, or even the math tests, like, is it saying obtuse angle, or is it saying obtuse angle in, like, Amharic, right? I think those are important. So I hope these are some comments that you can maybe make some use of, hopefully. But I really enjoyed kind of like reading it and kind of struggling with it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much for the comments. I will definitely look into these comments more carefully. But yeah, let me start with obviously the power thing. I've thought about that, and I'm still struggling with that. And that's a very interesting suggestion. But when it comes to the treatment, obviously the switch is more of a, in a way, exogenous, because of course it depends on in which specific state you are, but states have the, for instance, one of the reasons that SNNP state chooses to transition to English instruction earlier related to the other states is because of its diversity. It's way diverse compared to the other states. So in order to bring everybody on the same boat, I think one of their explanation is in order to bring everybody on the same boat, maybe it's good to sort of move to English instruction a bit earlier. When it comes to the other sort of plausibly exogenous variation, I guess, maybe the way I presented or jotted down in the paper might not be as clear, so I'll take responsibility for that. But I actually observed the language of instruction in the school, because this is a school survey, in the school. And also, I observed the language that these kids use at their home, which presumably to be a mother tongue. So it's not proxied by, in a way, whether you are a language majority or minority. I know whether the language that you speak at home is the same as or different from the language that your school uses. So, but I think a related concern could be if, for instance, highly motivated parents or households sort of self-select themselves by migrating to state or other subnational government level in order to ensure that their kids are being instructed in their mother tongue. So that's a genuine concern, and it's really difficult to kind of tease that out. But what's comforting for me is, first, I looked at in the paper, in the data. First, migration, at least particularly in the state that I'm considering, is not that of big. It's less than, I think it's about 9% of the people have moved in the last 10 years. So this is the information I have in the data. And also anecdotal evidence suggests that typically Ethiopian parents move for economic reasons, not for like searching for better schools. This is just like anecdotal evidence, so maybe I should come up with something a bit more convincing to say that there is no endogeneity because of migration, or there is no selection of that sort. But yeah, it might be a bit difficult. So, but the other thing that I checked, I think I've mentioned it somewhere in the footnote or in the paper, is when you look at migration by these two groups, it's not significantly different. And I think this makes me a bit comfortable, and I'm not that much worried about the treatment, but the treatment is not in the, in the traditional sense of treatment, because everybody moved to English instruction. So for me, the treatment is whether you have been instructed before you move to English instruction, whether you have been instructed either in your mother tongue or some other language. And it's not proxied by your location of residence. It's actually proxied. I actually observe, both languages, like the language of instruction and the language you speak at home.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We don't have much time. Maybe one or two questions we give you today. To you. One? Okay.
Thank you. I was wondering, I'm not sure if that's relevant at all to your to the Ethiopian setting, but what role do the capacities to teach in a specific language play? Especially, like, do you have, if it's not that widespread of a language, are there textbooks available in that language? Do teachers know how to teach kids reading in that language? Does that play a role? I mean, it would downward bias the effects you're finding. So, yeah, if you get positive effects with that effect, you're well off. But I was wondering if that.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. I mean, back in the days, right after the reform was signed into law in the mid-1990s, that was a major concern because it was really difficult to find, qualified teacher who can teach in this local language. But it has been like more than 25 years, and you don't see this keep coming as like a problem. For most of the languages, there are like people from a similar, if you want, language group or ethnic group who are way experienced to teach this kid, because we are talking about grade 4 and 5 students. So I think that's my immediate response, but I do observe the language that the teacher speaks at home. If I do some sort of maybe matching language groups between teachers and students, and maybe I might tell some story, but I didn't try that yet. But that's a very good suggestion.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move to the third presenter. Dirk is presenting on effect of high versus low quality preschool, a longitudinal study in Mauritius.
Okay, thank you all for being here. And, well, after Berkey's talk, I don't think I have much to say anymore, but we have to spend here 20 minutes nevertheless, so I'll try to fill them up. Because you will see that many of the conclusions that we find are similar to some of the things that he said. So this is a paper that is joint work with people from the psychology department in my university. So this is the first and the last author. And José Luis, who is a former PhD student of mine, who is now working at IFPRI. So, what do we know? Well, we know from the literature that preschool programs, they can increase, let's say, educational achievements of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a whole list of papers, that I cite here that have shown this. What are we going to add to that? We're going to add to that by doing something that is different in 3 respects. Okay? The first thing is we compare low-quality preschool with low parental involvement to high-quality preschool intervention with high parental involvement. Most of these studies, they compare preschool with the absence of preschool. So we compare high quality versus low quality preschool. Okay, that's a big difference. The second thing is, our children, they come from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. As you can see in the quote, the literature goes about kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Our kids were not selected on the basis of having a disadvantaged background. Yeah? The third thing that we are different in the literature is that we look at an intervention that took place a long time ago, right? In Mauritius in the 1970s. I mean, I guess many people in this room were not even born then, right? So you might wonder, what on earth can we learn from Mauritius in the 1970s? This particular experiment that we look at, it has some advantages in terms of interpretation of the results. Why? Because in Mauritius in the 70s, reality was basically quite simple in some respects. Basically, fathers worked, right? All fathers worked almost in our sample, more than 90% of them did. So basically, fathers' education level, we can say that's like a proxy for family income, right? Mothers did not work. Mothers did not work, they stayed at home. I think this is true for 80% of the mothers, and more than 95% of them said they are the primary caregiver for their children, okay? So the education levels of fathers and mothers have a clearly distinct role to play in Mauritius in the 1970s. I guess in many of our present societies, these two roles, income generation versus, let's say, giving intellectual support to the children, they are mixed between men and women, right? But that was definitely not the case in Mauritius in the 1970s, okay? So therefore, we think we can interpret the effects that we could find of father's education and mother's education in a relatively straightforward way. Much more straightforward than would be the case if you were to run an experiment like that with these kinds of variables at the present time. Of course, there are also disadvantages to the fact that we have this RCT trial for Mauritius in the 1970s. Okay. One disadvantage is external validity, right? There's Mauritius in the 1970s, and there's all the specificities of the program. Because you do an RCT, all these specificities matter, right? It is the program, in the particular way it has been implemented, that you are evaluating. Right? So you have to be very careful with drawing very big conclusions from RCTs. The other disadvantage is that our sample size is very limited. We actually only have 175 children. That is, of course, not much. But let me remind you that this is substantially larger than the samples used in the most frequently used studies. Okay? If you look at the preschool program, it had only 123 kids in it. The abecedarian program, 111. So let's be positive. Our sample size is more than 50% larger, right, than these other sample sizes. Right? Okay. Good. Now, what do we find? Well, we're going to look at the test scores of our kids at age 11. Okay? I will later explain a little bit more about these test scores. So this is a longitudinal study because this is a result that takes place, or that is achieved, let's say 6 years after the intervention ended. Okay? What do we find? Well, as Burke said, in his study, if you look at the longer run, you find no impact, okay? In the sense that the test scores for the kids in the high-quality program and the low-quality program, on average, they are identical, okay? But we do find some evidence of heterogeneity. What we do seem to find, to the extent that this is possible with such a small sample, what we do seem to find is that the high-quality preschool, it basically erases the effect of father's education completely. Okay? But it reinforces the effect of mother's education. Okay? So father's education is no longer important if the kids get this high-quality preschool, but mother's education becomes much more important to determine the test score results. Okay? So, what are our tentative conclusions from that? The first one is that high-quality preschool programs, they can compensate for the effect of monetary resources of parents, because remember, father's education is a proxy for parental income. This is a result that is out there in the literature. Okay? Those are 2 papers that have clearly demonstrated that that is possible with this kind of preschool programs. Okay? The second thing is that our particular experiment that we looked at in Mauritius, it was not just high quality versus low quality preschool, but there's also a big difference in the extent of parental involvement. There was a lot of parental involvement in the high quality preschool, and there was basically no parental involvement in the low-quality preschool. So therefore, if you increase parental involvement, then this can enforce the effect of the primary caregiver. Okay? So, simulating or stimulating parental involvement might be positive, but attention, we think, should go to the children whose primary caregiver has a low schooling level. Okay? So here's a little bit of background about Mauritius in the 1970s. I guess you all know this. It's a small African island in the Indian Ocean. It gained independence from the UK in 1968. Stable democracy, rapid socio-economic development, and very important for us, in the 70s, fathers worked, mothers stayed at home. Okay? It was a country that achieved very rapidly, already during the 1970s, universal and free primary education for both boys and girls, and primary health care for all people. And this is then about the school system. We had 6 years of primary schooling, right, followed by 5 years of secondary schooling, if you were admitted into secondary schooling. Okay. And admission to secondary schooling depended on a test score. This is the CPE score. This is a test score that we are going to use. Right. If you were not admitted to secondary education, then basically you could forget it on the labor market. So this was a very important test score. So I'm sure that all the kids and all the parents were very much motivated in order to get the kids to have a good score, because it was really crucial in determining the future of the kids. Okay? And the CPE score, so it's a national test, and it's basically a cognitive skills test. It's about 50% is language development, French and English, okay? 30% is maths, and 20% is what they call environmental studies. That's about the weighting of the subjects in the tests. The important thing is, I believe, it's a cognitive skill test. Right? Okay. So, what's the experiment that we're going to look at? Well, this experiment was conducted by psychologists, okay? And the purpose that they had was to see whether high-quality preschool had an effect on later psychopathologies, right? So it was really made or set up with the purpose of looking at the development of psychopathologies. Okay? To this end, they did this randomized experiment in which they compared, at one hand, high-quality preschool, which they call the nursery school. This is a kind of high-quality preschool according to all the standards that are known in the literature, so very low pupil to educator ratio, right? School days of 7 hours. There were parental teacher associations that were being set up. Parents had to visit the school regularly. The school personnel came into the home to talk to the parents, and the educators received, a lot of training, okay? The traditional preschools were completely different. Those were the kind of preschools that also Burke talked about, okay? Then at age 3, 100 children were randomly selected and paired with another child from the cohort on the basis of sex, ethnicity, and electrodermal activity. Electrodermal activity is something that we find as economists perhaps strange, but psychologists were convinced that this was important for the development of these psychopathologies. Okay, good. So here you get kind of the descriptive samples. Right? You can see that there is no difference between the treatment and the control group in terms of the mean score, right? This is similar to what Burke found. The standard deviation of this score is also virtually the same between treatment and control, okay? B, this is things that we call risk factors at birth. So these are things that were determined by the kid before it was at birth, basically, and this will be the things that we put into our regression at the end. But again, the important thing is that you see there's no difference, right, between the treatment and control group. In terms of other variables that we have, again, there is basically no difference between the treatment and control group. Okay? Okay. And what are we then going to do? Well, you have this test score, which is a score between 0 and 50. Yeah? And we're going to basically regress it on the treatment dummy, on some characteristics, right, and on the interaction effects between the characteristics and the treatment. Right? That's what we're going to do. And we're going to look at the coefficient estimates. Right? So you can see that beta k, that's the effect of characteristic k in the absence of treatment, and the sum of beta k and gamma k, that's the effect of the characteristic with the treatment. Right? So I'm going to skip this. Okay. Which variables are we going to use? Well, this is listed over there. Right? We first took quite a substantive list of variables that were determined at birth, or very early on in the kid's life. And then basically we only, because we have a small sample, you cannot take on board everything, so basically we only kept the significant ones, or the ones that were kind of significant, and deleted the others. And how did we find the selection criterion for keeping on in the significant ones is simply a t-stat that is larger than 1. So it's quite a conservative criterion that we use. Okay. Of course, you also have to run some balanced tests. And these are other observations that we had at age 3, so before the intervention started, and there was no indication whatsoever that the samples were different at age 3. Okay, on all this list of variables. So it seems that the randomization really worked, and so the samples are comparable. Okay, now let us look at the regression results, and this is the focal table in this presentation. You can see again, so the difference between specification 1 and 2 is that in specification 2, just the interaction effect with crowdedness in the house has been eliminated because it was not significant, but otherwise the results are very comparable. You can see again, of course, that the nursery school dummy in itself, it's not significant, right? What do we see? Well, you see that in the absence of treatment, moderate years of schooling has a positive effect, right? 1 year of schooling increases the test score with 0.88, right? Further years of schooling has a much larger effect and is statistically significant, okay? 1 additional year of further schooling increases the test score by 1.65. So this is in the absence of treatment. What happens with the treatment? Well, basically the moderate effect increases from 0.88 to 0.88 plus 1.51, okay? And the sum of these coefficients is statistically significant, right? So it increases, the treatment increases the effect of moderate education. What happens with further years of schooling? It goes from 1.65 and you have to subtract 1.59, so it's gone completely, okay? So the effect of father's education has disappeared. Yeah? Okay. So some of the risk factors do not, that we played around with, they do not feature because they were not significant. These are things like Creole, which is an ethnic origin, a dummy for an ethnic origin, 2 minutes, okay. Eldest sibling, male versus female, made no difference, was never significant. Yeah. In the absence of treatment, what is significant is the crowdedness dummy, so how many people that there are in the house of the kid, right? That has a negative effect on the test score, and the further years of schooling. With the treatment, crowdedness remains equally important, but now further years of schooling is irrelevant, mother years of schooling becomes relevant. Okay? And, well, I will leave that table just in case that you might want to ask something about it. I will come back to the table, but I'll keep it here, right? Okay. That's it.
Thank you. Discussant?
Yeah, sure.
You know how to do this?
Nice, okay. So, yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation and paper. I really enjoyed it. It's well written and very interesting. And also, I like when the experiment was conducted. As you mentioned in the paper, it was really early in the days, like in late 60s or early 90s. So that makes it interesting, partly because at that time, women did not, generally stay at home. So I think it's really difficult to kind of find that kind of households in a large extent, even in African context nowadays. So the differences in the academic background and also the occupation that dads and mom choose help you sort of to tease out these reinforcing and compensating effects of the quality of school that kids attend. So that's, because of that, it's really interesting. So I don't have that much to say, but I have a few points that I would like you to reflect on, or maybe to think about, maybe considering in your next version of the paper. I think the first one is about the program itself. I know you have a section on the experiment, but I don't see, like, I feel like the explanation is not that great in terms of the selection criteria. I'm a little worried about maybe if there is, I'm not totally familiar with this experiment at all, but it would be great if you make your readers comfortable by explaining in a little more detail the ways that these kids, the 100 kids are being targeted or included in the program. I know you mentioned something like this is from the polio vaccination record. So I think that particularly makes me a little bit concerned, especially if the other kids in the not included in the program, the other 100 matched kids might come from. I'm not sure whether from the same polio vaccination record or from somewhere else. If it is from somewhere else, you might want to say a few words about how this might bias your estimates. So the other thing is, actually you have already mentioned it, which is about sample size. So I think 175 seems to be really small, and you still have treated and control group in a way. So this is in each cell you have like less than 100, and you can even see like the number of observation in different cells. So that might be a concern, and you might want to make again your readers a bit comfortable about the sample size by saying few words about this. So the other thing is, now we are comparing good quality school versus bad quality, relatively not so good quality schools. And the test is administered at age 11, when the kids are, I guess, in grade 6 or 5, at the completion of the primary education. So I'm wondering whether there is differential dropout rate in these two schools. And also maybe, I think the initial starting sample size is 100, at least for the targeted kids. So I'm assuming initially it was like 200, and now you are working with 175 individuals. So whether, the first thing that comes to your mind when you compare good quality and bad quality schools is the dropout rate in good and bad quality maybe not the same. So I'm not sure whether that somehow have implication on your results. The other one is interpretation about the interaction of home visits and mom's education. That's sort of reinforcing. And but what I'm wondering is, we know this kind of interaction improves the child's education and language development, right? But not science and math. So because you have all these test scores on like language, I think you are working with the weighted average of language, math, and science. So I'm wondering, in order to reinforce your explanation, if you can run a similar sort of regression for the math and science. You should not be able to see the reinforcing effect if your explanation is actually what's going on. So maybe it's interesting to see the results being run for a subsample of like these tests. But I'm not quite sure whether that's even doable given the data you have. I guess the other thing that, just out of curiosity and maybe as an extension of this paper, I know sample size is still an issue, but now these kids are really adults now, I guess maybe in their 40s. So I'm wondering whether it's possible to trace these individuals down and see if there is any labor market outcome. So I guess these are the main comments I have, and thank you again for a nice presentation in the work.
Okay. So thank you very much for these comments. So the follow-up, that's going to be quite difficult, I guess, but yeah, so I don't think we can do much about that, but I agree this would be very interesting. Your suggestion to look at interaction separate for math and science at the one hand, and language, that's an interesting one. That's definitely something that we shall have a look at. Now, your concerns with the way that the sample has been drawn, it's true. So basically, the first sample is a very big sample of more than 1,700 kids, and they were drawn randomly from the polio vaccination record. Then out of those 1,700, they randomly drew 100. And then, within that 1,700, they matched these 100 kids with another 100 kids. So all the kids come from the basis is the same portfolio vaccination record, so there's no difference in that respect. So it's true, we have 200 kids, while in estimation we only use 175. The reason for that is because in the late 70s there was a big cyclone that hit Mauritius, right? And some of the kids could no longer be traced because of that. So this was a completely exogenous event that we have no reason why it would affect the treated and the control group differently. And small sample size, it's very unfortunate, but there's not much we can do about it. But thank you very much for your comments.
Okay. Some other questions?
Thanks very much. So the last comment you made me think of something. So if you have the pairs with the information, we would say today that you should be controlling for those fixed effects. Like that would give you a lot of power, actually. But then the problem with it is that pairwise randomization doesn't allow you to do any heterogeneity analysis because you have now experiments within pairs. So there's going to be no heterogeneity, kind of like almost by definition. So if you know the identities, it would be useful to just throw in all the kind of like pair fixed effects in there, although 75, I guess they'll take half of your degrees of freedom. But so that's one. And then just responding to the small sample size, we should remind ourselves that individual randomization, 175 is actually pretty good. Because 128 people is all you need for like to detect a standardized effect size of 0.5. So here, if you thought it's maybe 0.3 is reasonable or something like that, you get to a few hundreds. I mean, we in development economics, we just don't have a lot of luxury to do individualized randomizations. That's why we always worry about power. But 175 actually isn't all that bad. That's why Abecedarian and Preschool are so famous, because even with 111, they could actually show things, right? So then the other thing is your interpretation. So I never actually heard it put that way. So the way you said it was that the treatment got rid of the parent gradient, so to speak, or the parent effect. But the other way to say it is that the treatment had a really negative effect for highly educated parents.
For highly educated fathers, yes.
Fathers, right?
Yeah.
So, but then it's the opposite for the mothers?
Yes.
Right, so yeah, I think it would be nicer to maybe the paper does this, to speculate a bit more or dig into it. And then whenever I see those things, usually we don't see this in experimental settings, but when we see mother and father's education put into the same regression, as soon as I see divergent signs and similar magnitudes, plus and minus, I think multicollinearity immediately. So I wonder if there's any of that going on.
Well, this table shows you that the two are clearly heavily correlated, right? This table shows that the education levels of mothers and fathers are heavily correlated, but it's not perfectly correlated. Right? So it's basically father's years of schooling and mother's years of schooling, and I use some intervals, right? So you can see that along the diagonal there is a lot, right? But there's also quite a bit of the diagonal, okay? Yeah? And so also in terms of within the control group, them having opposite signs, that is not true. Okay? Yeah. Or within the treatment group, them having opposite signs, that is not true.
I wonder, so what's your explanation? So the mother's at home, father's not. I see the mother enhancing just like our own study, because it's like, but the father is not there. So like, what's the explanation for the negative effects on educated fathers' children?
Well, so I guess there is literature on this that says that the effect of parental resources can be get rid of by preschool, right? And the reason that they say is that the preschool, it manages to substitute for the lack of material resources within the family. Okay? And what we suggest is that that seems to be the case in our sample also, right? But this preschool, coupled with parental involvement, right, where you have parental-teacher interactions. I think it is well known that teachers pay much more attention to educated, when they have an educated counterpart than when they have not an educated counterpart. There's perhaps also a bit the specificity of this test, which is, the test after age 11, after primary education. If you're a mother that does not have primary education, how are you going to help your kid to pass this test? And that could also be something that is specific in there, right? So I think there are several ways in which mother's education indeed
Okay, now we move to the last presenter. Can you use this? Yes. Okay, thank you. I'm presenting preschool and completion of secondary education in Ethiopia using Young Life dataset, which was used also partly by Yared previously. This paper is different from the others. Is not talking about impact or experiment. It is an observational data. So early childhood is a very critical period of children's life. It's a crucial phase of growth and development where early circumstance can influence outcome across the entire course of the individual's life. And preschool education is part of the early childhood phase, which is critical in forming the foundation for lifelong learning and providing children the opportunity to reach their full potential. This early preschool education is also supposed to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and inequality. The previous research has indicated that the social return for preschool education is around 8.6%, where half of it comes from increased earning for children when they grow up during the labor market outcome. When we come to the Ethiopian situation in this context, there is little empirical evidence on the long-term impact of preschool education in Ethiopia because there was no such data. But now we have Young Life data, which follows two cohorts of children and is suitable to assess the long-term impact of preschool on school completion. Ethiopia has lately seen much improvement in net enrollment rate in primary education, reaching 94% in 2014 and 15, but the enrollment rate below the primary education is very low, and above the primary education is also extremely very low. The following graph tells us that the enrollment in primary education is high, as long as 94% in 2014-15. And when you go up, then the enrollment gets declined and reach 8.1% for higher education, 3.4 for TVET, and high school even is 20.2, is extremely very, very low. So our research question is that does attending preschool offer an advantage on successful completion of secondary education? Does the 2 or 3 years of preschool education have additional benefits on the completion of the secondary education? Does the impact of preschool education go beyond the successful completion of secondary education, such as transiting to institutes of higher learning? These are one we try to answer in this study. So we have an assessment of the different kind of preschools that are given in Ethiopia. The one is that the one provided by the private school where parents are paying, and in this private preschool, usually people from the higher socioeconomic status are joining, but there is a conflict between the private and the school curricula and Ministry of Education guideline, where they have their own curriculum not following the Ministry of Education. And the other is a government preschool, which they call it a zero O class, which is, they call it a zero grade, and child to child. And this is a recent initiative by the government. It is widely spread very recently, but these schools lack materials, and the class size is very like 50 up to 100, and poor management, and there is little in-service preparation, but usually the law, because it is free, children from the lower socioeconomic status can join this kind of preschool. The other is a quasi-public school and community mission church school and non-government NGO schools. These are a mixture of, because they provide also scholarship to lower income family, so a middle and upper class can join. Their quality is more or less good, but they have their own curriculum, and these are schools where the Western cultures are cultivated also in this preschool. In terms of quality in this one, the one provided by the private school, and these are more quality, and these are really a lower quality, and they are very recent initiatives. The conceptual framework that we use is that we formulate the conceptual framework of preschool investment decision of an altruistic parent built upon the work of Heckman and Roth. They define 3 critical periods of life of a child: the preschool age, the primary school age, and the high school age, and beyond high school could be up to higher learning or the labor market age. And let's denote that PS denotes the level of parents' preschool investment that helps child to develop cognitive and non-cognitive skill. And each type of skill that the child acquires depends on other factors: the home environment, home socioeconomic status, measured by Wells Index in our paper, and level of parental education and related social skills. Our conceptual framework is coming from the altruistic parent assumed to decide the level of optimal preschool investment by solving the Bellman equation of dynamic programming problem. I wouldn't go in detail about it, but this Bellman equation deals with the value of a decision problem at certain point in time in terms of the payoff for some initial choice and the value of the remaining decision problem that results from this initial. But in our data, there is no information how much parents spend for preschooling. Therefore, we define dummy variable. We create dummy variable if the parent sends the child to preschool center anytime between the age of 3 and 6 years old for at least 6 months. Again, to examine the differential effects of the duration of attendance, which are also associated with the quality, we divide the number of preschool academic year into 3 types: 1 year preschool attendance, 2 years preschool attendance, and 3 years preschool attendance. The reason why we do is that now government has a recent initiative to provide only 1 year preschool attendance, and that has an implication also for that program. We develop a logit model of completion of secondary education, which is our dependent variable, approximated by the dummy variable if the child completes 10th grade by the age of 19 years during the round 4. The average age is 19 years. So we develop a logit model, and where as part of this vector of X, one of the variables is the preschool attendance of children. But when we look at the preschool attendance, there is a potential indigeneity because there is a fixed household effect that is not able to find here. So the preschool can be correlated with an observed heterogeneity and with the error term, so most likely is an endogenous. So we check this endogeneity using a standard IV, using the community dummies as an instrument. This community dummies, there is no way that they are directly correlated with high school completion, but the preschool setup are usually highly associated with this community dummies. And the second, the Wooldridge IV, this is basically the same, but they have other instruments but not in a clear way. And we also check the robustness of our results using the propensity score matching techniques within the common support, whether preschool would have an impact to supplement to check our results. So the data that we use is Young Life longitudinal study, which is a rich data set on this aspect. In Young Life, we have 2 cohorts of children, the younger cohort, but now, because we want to see the high school completion, so we use the older cohort. And although we start observing the older cohort at the age of 8, we have a school history data set within it, what happens from birth up to the age of 8. So we have that, and through that we capture the attendance of these children in preschool, their history and what kind of preschool they have attended. And we are at the 4th round. The 5th round is not yet ready for analysis. We just now completed the data collection. So we use the 4th round data. At what stage are these children who were 8-year-old in 2002 now are 19-year-old at the end of the round 4. So we are using this 1,000 children for this paper. If we see the descriptive statistics of the variables that we are interested, about 49% of this 1,000 children have completed 10th grade, but if you see rural is very low, and preschool attendance between 3 and 6 years is 25% for urban, and for rural is extremely very low. For 1 year preschool, for 2 years preschool are also very low, but higher for urban area. And around 16.5% of those children are enrolled in private schools. The others are in community and governmental preschools. This is the highest education certificate received, this 1,000 children, the highest education certificates they received. So if we see here, this red line for the total, around 36% of them do not have any certificate or primary completion. Around 30% they have completed grade 8 at the age of 9, and 26% completed secondary school, and less than 1% TVET, and 6% of them have already entered into the university. So let's go directly to our results. So we have our dependent variable is high school completion, and if we see the red line dummy, if the child attends preschool between the age of 3 and 6, is highly significant. And when we decompose this preschooling into 3 duration periods, then we see all of them are significant, but the dummy for 3 years of preschool attendance is higher in magnitude. These are the marginal effects that we provide these figures. So is higher, you can see, and for the third model also, we see that in terms of who owns this one, the private schools have higher impact than the others. We use also the ordered probit model, and where a significant result that I want to show you is here, is that the dummy variable for 3 years of preschool is significant for probability of entering into higher institution. And that 3 years preschool attendance is all the way significant for teacher training or TVET certificates, and high school completion, primary education completion, and also being in school but not completed. But when we see the 1 year and 2 year, we don't see them being significantly correlated with the completion. So we've run the IV and propensity score, and the results are much more similar, so indicating that our results is robust. So I will go to the discussion. Preschoolers are 25.7% more likely to complete secondary education than their non-preschool counterpart at the proper age. The marginal returns are higher for 3 and 2 years. Those who attend 3 years are particularly found with higher probability of making transition to higher education at the age of 19. This is a result of the skill baggage skill effect. The results are robust to alternative methods of estimation. The outcome of this research is important in several ways. First, while Ethiopia obviously seen a stride in the education sector over the last and half decades, in terms of secondary education is only 20% enrollment so far. Higher education is 10%. The proportion of net enrollment are still very low. One possible reason for such low rate could be low preschool access being experienced in the early years of child life. This suggests that more public investment in this vital learning stage must be designed. Now, most preschools are left for the private school, government is not putting, except the new initiative where they support only the 0 grade or the O class or child to child. So we comment that the O class initiative taken by the government, but important to underline that it is a full 2-year or 3 academic year of preschool that is found to have a long-term effect on the educational pathway of children and led to the institutions of higher learning at a proper age. Those children who were with 1-year-old preschool attendance are not significantly different from their non-preschool counterpart, especially with respect to transition to university and to the college. Third, Ethiopia is currently aspiring to be a low middle income nation by 2025, but such economic aspirations seeks abundant middle skilled workforce, at least with high school skill level that able to meet the 21st century labor market demand. Hence, human capital formation is a long-term course. It is indeed a wise investment to spend scarce public resource in quality early childhood education, where the current access of this vital stage of learning is as low as 24 out of 7.4 million preschool age children. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for this very interesting and a bit provocative paper, right? So this is, well, the paper. We have just seen the paper, so we know what it's about. And I've just listed some of the main findings briefly again. So, of course, if we believe these findings, right, then these are very important findings, okay? Yeah? Because it's clear then that this kind of a preschool intervention, right, expanding preschool would be a fantastic policy. Yeah? The question is, do we buy the story entirely, yes or no? And I will try to give some elements to question a little bit or to cause some doubt about the strength of the findings. Yeah? I'm not 100% convinced, but I'm a very hard man to convince. So it's, so let me just give you some, well, this is some elements why I'm not 100% convinced, right? Okay, the first, well, this is about the data, and if you read it, and then you go to the issues, then you can see that perhaps there's a tiny problem of attrition because of the original 1,000 children. By 2014, only 908 are left. So some have disappeared. Right? There could be an issue of sample attrition. Did you check for that? Perhaps you did, I do not know. Now, another issue that I find that I personally find a little bit worrying is that some of the control variables that you introduce, they have been measured after preschool, right? So you use, for instance, the height for age score at age 8, which is after preschool. Birth order and household size, it's not clear to me when it was measured, so perhaps you should mention it at some point. The wealth index, it's not clear to me when it was measured, and also it was not clear to me how it was constructed. But more worrying is, I guess, the fact that you use something like child labor for those who worked at least 1 hour at age 15, right? I find that a very strange control to include in this kind of regression. And the other variable, did the teenager become a parent? I also find that a strange control to include in the regression. I will come back to that in a minute, why I think it's strange to include that. Okay. So as you also showed in your slides, you have a dynamic programming model. It's an interesting model, but I do not quite see the purpose of that model in the context of this paper, right? So you state the model, but basically it's not solved, right? And also the empirical methodology does not seem to be entirely consistent with the model. And I don't think basically you need that model in order to have an interesting paper. So you might either decide to leave it out, right? Or you might decide to develop it more and get the empirical approach more in line with the theoretical model. Okay. What do we have to think about the basic regression results, which you do on the urban sample for the reasons that you mentioned, perfectly valid reasons? The difficulty for me is to interpret the results because they are not reduced form. They are not reduced forms. And the reason they are not reduced forms is because of those presence of those two variables that I just mentioned, labor experience at age 15, and if the teenage has become a parent, these are probably related to dropping out of the education system before that age, at which this thing is measured, and thus they are influenced by the quality of the preschool experience, right? So this kind of, therefore this is not a reduced form, because there's this effect that basically also runs through those two things that you have listed as controls. So it's not a reduced form. It's also not a structural form because some of the things that would follow from your structural model, your dynamic programming model, they are not included, such as the fees that are charged for the preschool, or, for instance, the distance it takes to go to the preschool. These kind of things, they are not there, and probably are very hard to get. Yeah? Okay. Well, this is just a small suggestion. It would be nice if you have the difference in the quality of the different forms of preschool, if you could illustrate that with quantitative data. So pupil-teacher ratios that are different between the private preschools and the public preschools and things like that. Yeah? Okay. So there are some reasons why I find the results difficult to interpret. Yeah? Okay, so what this is then, my own gut feeling about this issue is that the decision to send children to preschool and the choice of preschool, it really depends a lot on the resources of the family. Yeah? It is also very clear from your results that this is the case, because you have a positive effect of father's education on the decision to send the kid to preschool or not. Okay? And you also have a very clear positive wealth effect. I don't know how the index is computed. It would be nice if you would have some more details on that. Now then the big question to me, the resources of the family, they are crucial, and we have measures of the resources of the family in these regressions, the ones that I just mentioned. Now the big question is then, do these variables capture the resources effect adequately? You could say, of course they do, but then in terms of your conclusions, I'm not entirely convinced in the sense that, well, the small effect of the government preschool, government preschools have only a small effect, right, on completing secondary school, right? But then if it only has a small effect, then expansion of government provision is not, or might not be the solution, because it will only have a small effect. Okay? If these variables do not capture the resource effects sufficiently, then perhaps the preschool effect that you actually find is perhaps implicitly more a measure of a proxy for parental resources rather than the preschool effect. Parental resources, it could be material resources, although you have controls for it in there, but parental resources are much wider than just material resources. They could also be how much the parents stimulate the kids, how much the parents motivate the kids to go to school and things like that. The support that the parents give in a more general sense. And if that is the case, then again, expansion of government provision per se might not be the solution to the problem that you have this lower success rate in secondary school. So that's basically what I wanted to ask.
Okay, thank you for the comments. This will help us to improve our paper. Actually, if I start with the attrition, as you see, the attrition is very low. There are also children who passed away, which we don't count them as an attrition, but that is a natural phenomenon. But there are few children who have migrated abroad, which we can't follow, and there are few who disappear. But in general, compared to other countries, attrition is very low. But we have a test that the attrition is more or less random. So we should have explained that we have done this for other papers also. Height for age, child labor, all these are measured after the preschool. But here, what we are looking is what are the associated factors with high school completion. We are not here addressing what determines a children goes to preschool. Those set of variables are not presented here. What we did here is what are the associated factors for completion of high school. So child labor is there, height for age is there, because these are very crucial in other ways for high school completion. So we try to include those other confounding factors to bring the effect of preschool on completion. We're sure that we have not exhausted all the factors that affect the high school completion, but we feel that we have put the most important variables that are highly associated with the high school completion. That's why we bring them, including the Wells effect. We have been in discussion that rich people are more likely to send their children to preschool, and that the preschool effect on completion might be picking up the Wells effect. So we try to reduce that effect by including the Wells index. The Wells index here, we have in the main, we have an annex how Young Life computed. The Wells index is computed from household durables and access to services. We excluded the intermediate assets, but we computed from household durables and the houses, access to services, water, sanitation facilities, where the house is made, the roof, the wall, the materials. This is how we describe, we measure the Wells index. And here, the preschool involvement that we capture this is a cohort where we started following at the age of 8. The preschool is between 3 and 6. Then in round 2, we found preschool is very important. Then we put in our questionnaire to follow the education history of the child. The education history. So we follow all the early, at what time he entered preschool, year by year we try to get the school history. Then that way we measure the preschool, but we were not able to measure the cost that was paid, the cost. And so because of that, those cannot be there. So we take an indication that if a parent sends his children to preschool, then he spend. And we use the Bellman equation to motivate our reduced form equation. We are not solving it. If we want to solve it, we don't have enough measured variable in that one. But it helps us to think more into a long-term effect of preschool contribution to high school completion. So that's why we bring in the dynamic programming model. And then some of them there cannot be measured, then we take a proxy. For some of the variables are taken a proxy. And the quality is somehow, this is a preschool activity, not the current one, but this was 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, the preschool situation, that one. That one, most of them were private, and the quality is assessed by the duration. The quality is assessed by the duration. We have some question that measures the quality, whether it is given by private or the community, and parents have a perception of the preschool, whether that was quality. We have that perception. And that the table that we produce to assess the quality is based on that, the time period. But the current one is completely different. So the current initiative by the government is the O school, and child to child, where older 5 or 6 year grade children are playing with the kids, where teachers are observing them, what they do, and or a preschool class is allowed together with the primary school, and some volunteer teachers are coaching them, and there is no resources, the class size is very high. That kind of program is now available in Ethiopia, where they are trying to scale it up. So this is shedding light for that program. Not exactly, but shedding light for that program. Government understand now that preschool is very important for the long term, not only from this, but from various studies made. Then we have also other qualitative studies that we are currently doing that. But this study tells us that even if you provide them high quality 1 year, high quality 1 year is not going to give a good solution, is not going to make them prepare for the primary. That is the argument, the implication that we are drawing from this paper. Thank you. There are other questions? Okay, then thank you very much. We will close this session. Thank you for coming.